So I have a few thoughts that I want to share, some reactions and reflections of my own to the Alabama clergyman statement and the letter from Birmingham jail. They might seem slightly discombobulated because I have a lot of thoughts and I want to try and just like hit bullet points quickly. So the statement from the clergyman, basically, to me, I hear that their argument is that Martin Luther King's and the civil rights movement, this particular group from the civil rights movement, are leading these nonviolent protests. And their argument is that these protests are going to incite violence. They're basically saying that they will, yes, they're nonviolent, but they're provocative and they're going to incite the hatred of racist white people in the South. Now, to be clear, these Alabama clergymen are not for segregation. They are against segregation. However, they think that Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach is incorrect. So they argue that change should be made through legal channels and through law and order, and not and you shouldn't try to fight for change by marching in the street. Change doesn't happen by being in the streets. So to me, there are two things that I want to pull out of this statement from the clergyman. One is this kind of warning. They're warning the conservative government in Alabama that segregation and rhetoric around segregation will incite violence. They're also warning Martin Luther King Jr. that his tactics and the civil rights movement tactics of these nonviolent demonstrations, these direct actions, are also going to incite violence. And it kind of reminded me, both this call for unity and this kind of treating both sides the same, kind of reminded me of recent arguments in public discourse about, for example, well, the one thing about warning the government and Martin Luther King Jr. made me think of the marches in Charlottesville in 2017, where you had neo-Nazis attacking people at a peaceful rally and march, and Donald Trump coming out and saying that there were good people, there are fine people on both sides, there are troublemakers on both sides and good people on both sides, and it's just a this both sides fallacy kind of thing. That's just a false equivalency in my opinion. And the call for unity, kind of the idea that demanding to be treated as a human being, as an equal human being, is divisive somehow. It kind of reminded me of, also in 2017 with the Women's March. There was a lot of criticism of the Women's March because it was very white, and it was very centered on the voices and concerns of white women. And when people criticized that, the reaction was, we're all in this together. Like, you shouldn't be drawing attention to the racial dimensions of this, because that's just dividing the movement and it's being divisive. So that was a big conversation in 2017. Probably one that still needs to be continued and still needs to be had. To kind of pull out one last thing, but it's something that Martin Luther King Jr. talks about a lot, is this notion of the protests being extreme measures, because I suppose they were illegal, or they were made out to be illegal. So in that context, anything illegal becomes an extreme measure, whether it's peaceful or not. or nonviolent or not, this question of something being illegal becomes so important somehow. But let me get to Martin Luther King now, and that's exactly like my first note, is this idea that he talks about, which is that legality and criminality are constructed. Human beings decide what is legal, what is criminal, what is illegal. And he's making a differentiation between, laws that are just and laws that are unjust. One of the examples I think is interesting that he uses is the example of Hitler, that everything that Hitler did was perfectly legal because, what, he's the head of state. Um, and and in fact it was illegal to harbor a Jewish person who was trying to, escape or survive. And interestingly, and he doesn't say this, I don't know if it was common knowledge at the time. I don't think it's common knowledge now, but the system of racial segregation in the American South was actually an inspiration and a model for Hitler. There's a whole book about it that came out a few years ago. I have it, but I haven't read it yet. Called Hitler's American Model, and the whole book is just about how Hitler and the Nazis used this system of segregation as a blueprint for a lot of what they were doing in Nazi Germany. Incidentally, I just learned today, I'm actually in the middle of trying to cut this video, and I just saw a essay, an article that was shared with me by another professor, a professor from Klein, actually, and I couldn't resist putting it here. So, following up on how the Nazis used the segregated South as a kind of model for what they were doing in Germany, apparently Hitler has inspired some American police departments also. Actually, it was a high school newspaper that broke this story, that the Kentucky State Police, in one of their training manuals, actually quoted Hitler. There's this quote from The Guardian on the story. The genocidal Fuhrer is quoted more than any other figure in the presentation, on 3 separate slides. The very first, essential for success, is a perpetually constant and regular employment of violence, reads one of the citations. You can actually, if you go to where the story was published on the website of the high school newspaper, they actually have a link to the presentation itself, so you can look at it if you want. And here's a screenshot of, like, I guess the title slide. So it's interesting and also disconcerting that the Jim Crow South would have inspired Nazi Germany, and Nazi Germany would have inspired, a state police department. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but I wanted to point that out, and I'm going to go back to Letter from Birmingham Jail now. Martin Luther King Jr. talks about the focus on the actions of protesters rather than underlying causes of the protests. I think we can see a lot of that. The focus on what protesters are doing that, people don't approve of, rather than looking at the situation that caused the protests and riots to begin with. So Martin, what I'm doing basically is I'm trying to look at Letter from Birmingham Jail and pull out some of the things that I think are still really relevant. Another thing, I think, if I can go back to the idea that these nonviolent protests were seen as extremist, I guess potentially because they were breaking the law in some way. Some of them were, when they were deliberately breaking segregation laws, but to make a point, expecting to be arrested and all of that. This idea that these nonviolent actions are seen as extremist when there are much bigger demands that could be made. Okay, so for example, now the demands to abolish the police, I think, generally speaking, is seen as pretty extremist, as an extremist demand. But compared to a philosophy where you think the entire state apparatus needs to be dismantled and rebuilt, and a perspective where, so if you read the monthly review essay, it mentions how when if you have a situation where racism is baked into the system, then that will just be offloaded. That can just be offloaded into other kinds of the other whatever agencies would replace the police. Could still be a problem in there. So, for example, with child services and things of that nature, already are hugely problematic, racist. I was doing a bit of reading recently about how a lot of social services, like child services, Medicare services, are actually contracted out to defense contractors. Just as a side note, so they're it's not like social services are like this great, necessarily going to save everything. So anyway, in other words, like abolish the police in many ways is not that extreme. Is not that, and certainly defund the police, from that perspective, is not really an extremist position at all. And Martin Luther King Jr. talking about that in his letter kind of reminded me of that. How, when he's saying that, like, look, I'm very disappointed to hear that my nonviolent tactics are seen as extremist, because I tell you what, there are other people here who I sympathize with that have, much bigger expectations and demands. Um, so I hope that makes some sense. This is just sort of all my impressions and things like that. I mean, I'm not married to any of this, and I'm perfectly happy to be corrected or debated or whatever. This is just sort of, I'm trying to make sense. I'm trying to make the best sense I can of things. And so, whilst also trying to come at things from a more or less human rights perspective. A couple other points that I think are still relevant that I like from the letter are the idea that privileged groups, as groups, do not give up their privilege voluntarily. That's something that has to be fought for. It's not something it's rarely given by the oppressors. And this idea that there's a right way to protest, or that a protest, in the way Martin Luther King puts it is, protest is never well timed according to, those who are criticizing it or those who haven't suffered underneath the system. There's never a right way to protest. And he makes that point by saying how, he's being criticized for not negotiating. And he's saying, yeah, you're right, we should negotiate, but people aren't negotiating with us. So how do we demand that seat at the table to even have that conversation? Finally, he makes this one point that I just wanted to draw out real quick. He says on page 3, right in the middle of page 3, he's talking about just and unjust laws, and there's a part where he talks about there are some instances when a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there's nothing wrong with an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but when the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest, then it becomes unjust. And that's very, very echoing of Jim Crow laws and things like that, right? Like, You can't register. You're not allowed to vote unless you can read and write. Well, so many black people were not able to read and write, and so it looks on this supposed to look on the surface of it like it's not has nothing to do with race, but it really does. So that kind of thing, like getting someone in trouble on a technicality. I read a story. Police in North Carolina broke up a march to a polling place on some similar kinds of technicalities. They pepper sprayed these people who were marching. They had a rally and a march, and then they were supposed to go on to the polling place. And I read the story. I'm not convinced that there was any justification at all for pepper spraying these people. And the end result was a lot of them didn't make it to the poll to vote. And so it's just like yet another thing that is just still a problem in a lot of places.